Welcome to the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. Peter, how is it going?
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's been some great sports spectating over the last couple of days. We have a long weekend here in Canada, and yeah, it's just a lot of sports watching.
Yeah, seriously. So we were just at Canadian track and field trials in Montreal. So we've been in Montreal for the last few days. During that time, Tour de France started, Western States 100 miler happened, track trials in the US were going on. So to say that it has been an overwhelming with sport kind of past few days.
Well, and we're going to forget a few, but I mean, BC Bike Race starting up today, the long weekend in Canada, July 1st. And then also we have a couple athletes over in Europe, we're between World Cups, but there's been, I think, a Swiss Cup this past weekend. So it's just like a lot, which is like, as a coach, it's exciting because there's lots of, news and how people are doing. But it's also just like a lot to keep track of.
Yes, and just to be clear, if you're watching this on video, we are having some minor video issues because Zoom has reconfigured its entire structure.
Well, AI is probably saying, we shouldn't be in focus because we're ugly or something like
Ouch.
that. I don't know.
That seems pointlessly mean.
I don't know. That's how AI probably is. There you go. Maybe we're back.
I almost had it. Okay, there we go. We're fixed. Everything's fine. If you're on the new Zoom, really sorry. I feel like they've updated just so poorly. This has been a really rough week, actually, for software updates. I feel like Evernote is really letting me down. Todoist just released some integrations that seem to make it worse, not better. Just having a really rough go with all of my various things online right now.
Well, that said, one of the things that caught my eye about the Western States this weekend was actually that the coverage for such a, it wasn't, if we compare it to, like hockey in Canada or NFL football, it was not great. But as far as coverage of, if we compare it to like an Unbound gravel in the past, has been very hard to cover. They had feeds going from all these canyons where there's no, I guess they had the Starlink, satellite stuff to try and get any sort of feeds and updates. And it was just great, to be able to follow this over 14 to 18 hours. Certainly we went to bed and then woke back up and caught up on the live stream, but just exciting racing to be able to follow this. I don't think there's ever been a 100 miler that's been like that much coverage.
For sure. It's definitely been cool, the evolution of as ultra endurance in general, whether we're talking about biking or about running in the US, as that's really grown in popularity the last few years. Definitely races themselves have stepped up to figure out different ways to be able to, showcase the entire race. It feels like we have not really, regular sort of TV has not quite caught up, or regular broadcasting has not quite caught up with the ultra endurance thing. So it's really forced races to get super creative. Like Unbound's done a great job. BWR, so the Belgian waffle ride races, really they put a lot of effort in the last few years to try to make that work. And it's, having done follow car stuff with BWR for a couple of races, it's hard. You're in a lot of areas with zero cell coverage, and it is so frustrating to be filming and talking and doing all this stuff and then have it not go.
Well, and so Western States, they seem to do a good job that, the Starlink stuff is pretty new. The ability to send, video over distances in this manner is new, but then also a bit more accessible than, in the past it would be, you'd have to have a multi-million-dollar satellite that a transport truck brings it in and blasts it up to your own satellite or something like that. So that's sort of new and emerging where, for still a considerable amount of money to start getting these things moved around and have the people who know how to operate it and put it together into any sort of feed would be pricey, but it's sort of exciting to see that some of these sports we love, you can actually start following from a distance, which is cool. And so we had a few listeners and people, friends who said, they were watching it on and off over the course of the weekend and just, they'd go do their ride and then come back and catch up. So it's pretty exciting. Yeah, it's sort of neat. As I went into it, I was sort of like, this is really odd to be watching a sporting event that takes, 14 to 24 plus hours, but it was exciting. The last couple hours of the men's race was really exciting. The women's race was really tight, right through that whole top 10, going back and forth, and people falling.
With the exception of the first woman, Katie
Shai just put on, was amazing, just so fast. I think she just missed the top 10 in the overall in the men's as well, and so that was super exciting. She just missed the course record, but beat her record, and just super stable through the whole day. As she said, it was ups and downs. It just maybe people didn't see it, I guess, but.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting and a very weird thing for me because I was actually covering Canadian track and field trials, doing a bit of stuff with Canadian running, getting to interview the men and women who were, checking off their ticket or like getting their ticket to Paris for the Olympics. So really emotional weekend over at the actual track and field stadium. And it was so funny though, having this 100-miler playing as I'm like leaving to go watch the 100-meter race. And I think what's cool about having been at the track and field stuff was it really gave me this sense of like, oh God, like, I would never want to do it. Like, I am out of track and field. Like, do not sign me up. It seems horrible. Give me a 100-miler over 100-meter any day. Because like the stress and the focus and the work that goes into the 100-meter, like, it's funny because the faces at the end of a 100-meter race versus the end of a 100-mile race are the same. Like, it's the same athlete reactions.
Right.
Which I thought was just such a cool juxtaposition, getting to then come home and, it's 11:30 at night and, you're already in bed and you're just like half asleep, just like, Jim Walmsley won.
Jim got it. Jim got it. Yes. Did you have any takeaways from watching track racing and track and field in general? There was also the shot put and stuff. Did you have any takeaways over the 4 or 5 days you were there?
For sure, yeah. And I'm actually working on a post right now for consummateathlete.com, our blog, about sort of some of the lessons endurance athletes can take from what I observed at track and field trials. I think just what I really appreciated about the athletes was, with track and field, the importance of the mental game and how much the top athletes prioritize it. The guy who won the 800 meter, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, Marco something, or Marcus. Anyway, amazing race. And, he was talking about the mindset piece and the, chatting with his sports psych beforehand and all of this kind of stuff. And, really like figuring out how he was going to, get from one race to the next. Actually, it was the 200-meter winner who had a bad 100-meter race, and bad is in quotes here. He's going to Paris for both, I believe. Okay. But he had a, quote unquote bad race on Friday, and like literally had a call with his sports psych on Saturday so that he could come into Sunday for the 200-meter, right, like refreshed and like ready to go and refocused and reframed. And he just had some of the best stuff to say. And maybe we'll post that actually on our Instagram because I grabbed that caption.
It strikes me, last week we were talking towards that quote, the Roger Federer thing, and I didn't really read the quote, but you can look it up. And it was sort of this idea of like, he lost a lot of the points, but then he obviously was very successful as far as matches, but we forget that he like lost a fair bit. And so his thing was very much, once that point is gone, you have to go for the next point and focus on that, regardless of the whatever happened, win or loss in the last point. And it's probably similar with a track and field, where it's you do this trial or this heat or this different event, and then you have to move on to the next one.
Yeah, and I mean, I really saw that with Misha Powell. And actually, side note, we have a new book out today, or I have a new book out today.
I was going to get you flowers. I forgot. Maybe I spoiled it.
Well,
I can still get you flowers.
I mean, to be fair, I also this morning was complaining about flowers.
Yeah, so maybe there's flowers in the van, and I'm just like, oh, sorry. I would never get you.
Never, ever.
Cut flowers.
I was whining about flowers, which is like the worst thing in the world to be whining about. But flowers are such a pain in the ass when they, like you've had them for a week, it's beautiful, and then you have to deal with them.
Okay.
Anyway, so side note, yes, Misha Powell and I have a book out. It's out today, Sprinting Through Setbacks. I'm so excited to put it out. I co-wrote it with Misha. It's based on 10 of her most pivotal races in her career. So not just like the highs of her career so far. And I say career so far, we're still far from done. But 10 races that really exemplify lessons she's learned, ups, downs. And it's just been so cool getting to co-write a book with someone like Misha. She's so positive, just so fun. I think anyone can take a lot from this book, but definitely if you have young women athletes in your life, like it's definitely targeted towards them, sort of helping with that, whether it's imposter syndrome, identity, a sense of belonging, self-belief, all that stuff. It's all in there. It's so good. It's so excited.
Any of the younger women who have grown up with shred girls.
Exactly. Yeah, it's actually like perfect for that age.
Nice moving to the non-fiction from the fiction. Lovely. Well, congratulations on that. And yeah, that's exciting that came out right after trials. That was like you planned it.
Like I planned it. Yeah. So that's out with Strong Girl Publishing. You can find it at stronggirlpublishing.com, or we'll include a link to it in the show notes. But anyway, what I was going to say is actually, so Misha was racing the 400. She had to do semifinals, and the hope was to do finals, and the hope was to qualify for the Olympics. Like, that's really what we've been talking about. And, she's really been gearing up to this whole season. And she's had a lot of issues with injury. She had a hamstring thing last year. She had a hip thing this year. So it's really been a lot of, trying to figure out what's going on, fixing something. And then it seemed like, honestly, track and field, this is one of my lessons I've learned from track and field. Basically, the person who wins is largely, by and large, the person who isn't injured in the field.
Less injured, yeah. Because
it really seems like everyone is dealing with some kind of illness or injury or something, which I guess makes sense, though, because like in endurance, so like Tour de France, 100 milers, any stuff like that, you can get away with niggles and like minor illnesses.
People finish the 100 milers hobbling sort of comically.
Exactly.
Anyone who doesn't look, that's like the main commentary. Is like, they look so fresh.
Like, it doesn't make sense. Yeah. Like, basically, you can kind of go into, and knock on wood that you don't, but like, you can go into ultra endurance stuff pretty injured and like still get through.
Probably shouldn't, but yeah, people do for sure.
Well, certainly like, oh, I have like a tight hip. Like, okay, fine. You're still going to be able to run a 50 miler.
Speed kills, so there is that intensity piece where, sprinting involves slamming your feet into the ground as hard as you can, basically.
Yeah.
And bouncing violently,
Yeah, and oh my gosh, the number of like trips at the finish line, like with the track, like because you're just suddenly like the brakes are on, the track spikes dig in, and you're just down, is wild. But yeah, what I learned basically is like to excel at track and field, you basically have to be completely 110% injury-free, illness-free. Like, all systems need to be go for you to have that race, because milliseconds count. There were a couple of races that were down to like into the hundredths of a second, not the tenths. A couple photo finishes where they actually called it wrong, and they had to like then change the board. Anyway, Misha's going for the 400. Unfortunately, she just didn't have the best race at the semifinals, so she didn't actually make it into the finals, which could have been this huge blow. I mean, you're seeing, 4 years of work, basically, and then to have this one race where suddenly Paris isn't happening. It's not on the schedule anymore. Could be so devastating. And sort of this goes to what we were talking about last week. Like, if that's the only thing, if like that's how you look at your career, that is the only thing, you're going to be in trouble. So to see her then, I talked to her a couple hours after, sat down with her, and she was just like, yeah, so Sunday's the 200, so the 200 semis and the finals. She's like, this just means I can completely go for broke in that, because I can. Like, she's not worried about her hip or her legs or anything. There's no fear of like, oh, if I tweak my hip a little bit more, like that could be bad for Paris. Like, no, now it's okay. We're just going to give this 100%. And again, I think I'll try to post this one on our Instagram. When you see her lunging for the finish at semifinals, like, she ended up second in the semifinals, so she qualified for finals, which in the 200, it's actually crazy because there's 3 heats. So instead of being the top 4 from the semis, it's actually the top 2 and then the 2 best times after the top 2. So she ended up second in her qualifying heat. And like, when I say she lunged at the finish line, holy moly, she lunged at the finish line.
Well, sort of neat to see all these different sports, or at least variations of sports that we love and do. So it's certainly invigorating, even just watching these different things over the weekend's been really exciting.
Yeah, super cool. And I mean, I'd never really watched any field events, but for Canadian Running, I was interviewing Paralympian shot putter Greg Stewart, who just has a new children's book out now, which is actually super cute. I just ordered it for our niece for her birthday. Side note, just put it out there. Maybe everyone should do that. We'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. Watching shot put, just wild. And even just the coolest thing about track and field was seeing the different body types that are going to the Olympics for track and field. A little too much of the bodies of the decathletes who, for some reason, when they crossed the finish line after the last race of their the decathlon, all of the men just took their shirts off and posed for a bunch of pictures, showing their muscles, like Superman style. It was very odd. Apparently this just happens every year. I asked a couple people about this the next day and they're like, oh yeah, they just always do that.
They're supposed to be the fittest athletes or something like that, right?
Yeah, like literally one reporter's like, oh yeah, they just want to show off their bodies. I was like, that is a weird thing.
Yeah. I wasn't aware, but I guess that makes sense. I think I recall things like that happening at the Olympics.
They all, and simultaneously too, all pull off their shirts just in perfect unison. At one point they all whirled them over their heads in unison. I don't know. It kind of made me want to do decathlon.
I mean, it's a pretty cool thing, really. I guess it's sort of up our alley.
I was going to say, from the consummate athlete perspective, I think maybe our next thing is we're going to be
curious. I don't know. It's like another one of these ones that's sort of hard. I don't know where you would go to prepare for that, really, right? And then for a master's person, I don't know what's really accessible for that.
And do masters get to take their shirts off and whirl them around?
Yeah, because there would be no masters at this, because this was just trials, right?
Yeah, this is just trials.
In my head, it was also nationals, but that's not true.
Well, so it was nationals, but only for elite and under 20s.
Okay. So there's that. So I think, that idea of moving on to the next point, the other thing if I had to take a takeaway from Western states, the running 100 miler, we didn't really say what that is, but it's sort of like the North American, it's like one of the biggest races in the world, is what they sort of certainly gauge themselves as. And certainly people go there and that's like a career maker if you can do well.
I would say it's akin to Unbound as far as
Gravel,
race, race statuses.
And so what struck me as Jim Walmsley, is big in the ultra running world, certainly has been very successful at this race. And so what struck me as this race actually was very back and forth. In the past, he's sort of run away eventually and then didn't have a ton of people back and forth, but there was much more back and forth in the final half, I would say, but certainly the last few hours, there was back and forth. And some of that is that timing of the aid stations and how much time you're spending in the aid station, which, you're seeing that in gravel right now too, where there's people who just roll through and try and skip it, but then they end up not taking care of things. And Jim, I guess, was having foot starting to get blisters. And so he kept changing his socks and his shoes completely. And then the other guys would come through, but then he would make sure he had his fresh bottles and all this. And then in the last bit was sort of accelerated. And so he was trying to not end up with a horrible blister, which actually took out the third place woman. Actually had to drop out because of it, just a brutal blister. So it just struck me as, he's losing that phase. If that maybe that section, he's slower. He's become now he's back in second, and he could really beat himself up as he hasn't really been behind at that point in the race. And then, keeps trying to get himself to the finish. And he said there was a lot of self-talk and okay, it's going to pay off later. I'm going to be okay. Mm-hmm. Right. So even the best, who's won before and ended up winning fairly handily, was back behind people doing things like changing your shoes. But he very much stayed focused on that. What do I need right now?
Yeah. And I mean, it can be so hard when you're used to leading a race. And this is me on a very local level when I say this, but I have a huge problem with that because a lot of the time when I race locally, I am either certainly the first woman in a lot of local stuff, but often the first. Mm-hmm. And when I'm not, it can be so hard to just kind of not automatically start being oh, maybe this is wrong. Maybe this is wrong. Maybe this is wrong. And you start picking up these little oh, does my stomach hurt? And you kind of start almost talking yourself into feeling worse.
Sure.
So for me, that's actually a huge thing I'm thinking about.
And maybe I'm not fit anymore, even though everyone was running super fast, right? Around record time, there was top 10 men were under, was it 14 or something like that? Mm-hmm. It was all pretty high paced, the top 10 times ever. So even if he hadn't won, it would still have been a good time for him.
Right.
Which is amazing. But yeah, the second place, gentleman, and I'm blanking on his name, Rod.
I was gonna say Roy or Ray or something. I don't know. Sorry,
his
apologies.
Coach was on the feed they did an interview with him, and he was saying their strategy basically was, Jim had never been behind before, and so it actually was you've never led the race before, but like he's never been behind. And so they were doing, I just spoke about that last week too, where I try and get athletes to just go around and test people, even if they're on their limit. Sometimes that just like people blow up because you're suddenly in front of them and they start doubting themselves. So they were trying to do that to it, right? Like it almost sort of worked. Even though it was a little aggressive for the person in second, they were, in the lead a bunch of times. So sort of neat to see that, like, mental, I think I called it like psychological warfare in some way.
For sure.
But just all those different elements coming together. And again, everyone having to be mentally strong about their own race. And like, it is enough to finish or to finish at like a good pace for you. And then also, being patient, especially in these long races, that stuff changes a lot in the last little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we haven't even touched on Tour de France, and we know a lot of people listening to this are in fact bike racers. So apologies for not getting to that yet.
We do have a couple quick questions today that we'll try and get to. But yeah, we thought just even talking through some of these races and just opportunities to watch sport and sort of the things we've was there anything in the first few days? You didn't get to watch a lot of Tour de France.
Didn't get to watch a lot of it, but have, kind of caught up with a bit of what happened. I think, well, to your point about like why we're talking about this, because I think it's easy to watch these things and not take anything away from them, just kind of watch them as cool sporting events, which you absolutely should. They are super cool sporting events. But I do think for anyone, any level, there are takeaways that can come from this. And often we tend to focus on the sexier takeaways, right? Like the marginal
Well, I
gain.
definitely bought the shoes that Jim Walmsley uses. Oh, whatever Jim uses, that's what I'm using.
You did say that in the car yesterday. I should have probably like called your credit card company and like put a stop on your card or something.
Hokas
like
for you.
No Hokas. If Hokas are ordered, just cancel
They're
that
super
card.
shoes though.
At any rate, I think a lot of the time we tend to you literally did the thing I was just gonna say. Is like we buy the gear that the person is using. Tour de France, like Team Sky's marginal gains thing. Everyone got super into that. You'll hear like, oh, like they were doing sodium bicarbonate, so I should be doing sodium bicarbonate.
10 emails about that in this last month.
I rest my case. But I think like a lot of the stuff we just talked about, it's a lot more of the what can you take from them in terms of the mental stuff, the preparation stuff, the more global things, not the little tiny things.
I think as someone who's going to be pacing you at Leadville is the plan right now and supporting you, that was like actually what I really was watching for. Was there were so many aid stations in this. I actually didn't expect there to be that many where they were actually doing aid station like that were more than like a neutral, like grab a banana and fill up your bottles, but they were actually doing like ice packs and how they were holding their water, because were they using packs or like everyone had a little strategy on their bottles and waters.
I'm a weirdo in the field of ultra running.
Well, I wasn't picking on you for that, but like, yeah, just like what were the different strategies? There was lots of variation. Like Jim Walmsley has like a random belt with like a side bottle and a back bottle, and there's just so many different ways that people are solving this problem of running over this 100 miles.
I have met almost no women who can run with the belts with the bottles. Like women's physiology is generally not conducive to belts, is what I've learned.
But as far as big things, that's what I was sort of watching. And similar with the tour, right? It's hard for a lot of people to sort of see themselves doing Tour de France style things, right? No one's following you in a car and passing you bottles, or you don't often ride with your 150 fastest friends. But you can see some of these like mental, the person who's the best person suddenly is having a bad day, and do they drop out of the race, or do they try and like get food back in themselves? How do they deal with that when it's not going well?
So this is actually the storyline that I've been the most excited about, is Mark Cavendish. So he's not going for, obviously, the Tour de France win, but what he is going for is one more stage win, which would put him ahead of Eddie Merckx for most stage wins of all time. And like Cavendish is already the GOAT in terms of sprinters. Like he really is just the greatest. But the world right now is rooting for him to get this like one more win.
Do you think that's I had another note here that I started watching a bit of the Unchained documentary on Netflix, which is, I think they call it's made by the Drive to Survive people.
Sorry, if you can't see this, I'm doing
Molly's
the world's
not big
biggest
at watching
eye roll.
Sports, but
No, it's the Drive to Survive, where it's like, oh, this is the tennis Drive to Survive.
Well, it's actually a drive.
This
I think they made it. Anyhow, the second season does talk a bit about Cavendish, and that was as he was just like finishing off his career for the second time, I think, and he was going to retire, and then now he's come back again to try and get that record.
Yeah, so his team Astana is literally their entire goal in this Tour de France is to get Cavendish to win a stage. Like, they do not care about anything else. I believe they're calling it Project 35.
Okay.
So anyway, the first stage, brutally hot. Cavendish does not do great in the heat. It's so irritating where they're like, he's so old. I think he's like mid-30s.
Right,
It's actually really upsetting, to be honest.
Well, and in Unchained, some of the younger sprinters like make fun of him. They're like talking about how he has gray hair and all this stuff. And I was like, he's not that old.
No, I think he's definitely under 40.
Yeah. Well, for sprinters, I guess you're old.
But it's great though, because like you saw in the video from the tour, like Astana, all of his teammates are literally just like bringing water bottles like up to him and like dumping them on him like in the race, trying to like keep him cool enough just to finish in the time cut. Like there was no like going for stage 1 sprint. They just needed him to get to day 2.
Oh, I see.
So the entire race was just the Astana team like literally pushing him through the stage, which like power of teammates. I mean, talk about like a great crew right there. But then, B, it's just like it's such a fun storyline where you're just like, you want him to get it so bad. I don't know that there's really any takeaway for a masters athlete other than like, I don't know, pay a bunch of your youngest friends to like herd around you and like do whatever you need them to do in a race.
Well, it occurred to me that, they kept saying trail running as a team sport was this like overarching thing in the Western states because of all the people who have to, like most people had, I don't know, 6 to 8, I would say, people, if not more, parents who came to watch or something. So they would finish running the last mile or two with sort of most of their team, whoever could run, I guess. And so they kept saying that. And I think in the tour, that's the case. But I think it's also like why we do a lot of this stuff is social. And no, maybe they aren't pushing you. Maybe they aren't actually like on your team. But, the people you do the group rides with, your training buddy. I think this is a great reason if you are getting a little worn down on the racing thing. Some of these things like stage races where it's a tag team are some of my fondest memories. Where you're just out on this 3 to 7 day adventure with friends. As we say, the stage races are starting up now with BC Bike Race, and certainly that'll go through the summer with all the other ones, Breck Epic and so forth. And most of them still do have these partner ones, but you could certainly enter anything with a just ride together, just set your own team event
for sure.
And that could be an adventure or something like that. So I do think that that's something that you can cue into is just this like team sport thing, especially if you are like, I'm over the whole racing thing, or I've been doing the same type of racing thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think it actually also is sort of a cautionary thing, especially when you're talking about the trail running thing. And this is certainly something we've been kind of running into as we're getting ready for Leadville, is that it takes a crew. So like when you are signing up for a lot of these things, I think it is important to consider like what it is you're going to be asking of your partner, your family, your friends, and the expense of it. Because, with Leadville, for example, like anyone we're having out, like obviously we're paying for their flights and their housing and all that stuff. So, if my sister has to come out to dog sit, which our dog's a nightmare. So there you go. That's, an extra couple $1,000.
Right.
And no, we're not putting him in a kennel.
So I think that's nice. I think the other thing is this crewing, like it is sort of like a fun experience. It is a weekend or plus out of your life, but it is, sort of an exciting thing to do. And some people really like that, having to drive the truck and like get the thing set up and like have the water ready. And, there's a lot of people who, yes, like to ride their bikes, but then some of that stuff is also exciting to go and see what the race is all about. And sometimes it's a different sport, right? Maybe you can't run anymore. You don't care to run. But you could support something like running or whatever your friends are into even, right?
For sure. It's also wicked stressful, just to be clear. Like crewing is like way scarier than actually
for sure.
racing.
I think I cry every time. And yeah, it's like, and you want to be set up because you don't want to be like, because people would miss at Western States because it's like hard to get between the stations. Like they missed in a couple places and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, you would be like hurling yourself.
Like, wow. And then you don't know if they're okay. Just like they've just continued on. You're like, they're so mad, but they probably don't have water.
Yeah.
Wild.
No, it's super stressful.
A couple other notes. Do you have anything else Tour de France wise?
No,
Derek G is still in it.
He is,
Okay,
yes.
good. Go Derek G, Canadian.
Yep, top Canadian.
I
mean, he
guess.
might actually be he might actually be one of the top racers in.
I think so. Yeah, I think he's past the top Canadian.
Yeah.
I don't know how many Canadian. Do you know how many are in the tour?
3.
It's usually
I might
2
be
or
totally
3.
lying. It's definitely 2 at minimum.
Okay. Well, there you go. Go Canada.
Did you have a note? Did you have a note from? You have a note in here from watching Unchained.
I think the only other one was in season 2, Tom Pitcock, who races mountain biking and cyclocross and also rode. So he did very well on the tour, I guess, in season 1 of this, which is the year before that. So that would be 2022, I guess. So he's in there and he comes back and he talks about the pressure. He's getting a massage or something after the first. He doesn't do great on the first stage, but he was like really amped that he thought he was going to win the Tour de France. Or at least a stage and be in the yellow jersey, I guess, was sort of his goal. And then he talked about how there's like now this new pressure, this expectation. I thought that just resonated as, when I see clients, they do their first year, there's no pressure. They maybe have goals. They want to get a certain belt buckle at Leadville or finish this stage race. But there's not, no one knows who you are. No one, I always say most people don't care anyhow. They're just excited you're doing it. But in our heads, we're a new person, so we don't know. We're just doing that completion. But once we say you complete before you compete. But the problem is once you do the completion, then in your head, you're saying, now I'm competing. So there's always this thing. And so that might be you going back to Leadville to get the coveted 9-hour belt buckle or a certain placing or age group placing, whatever it is you're winning. But now there's a pressure. There's an expectation. And it was interesting seeing Tom Pitcock, who has won world championships in multiple disciplines, great at the Tour de France in the year before, talking about the pressure and how he was so upset and he like blew up and he was like off the back in the first day of the tour and how he was like just beside himself. And he just was talking about this pressure and how it's just, he swore a couple times like it wasn't great. And then this other guy's talking to him and he says, Tom Pitcock says, you're only as good as your last race. And the other guy tells him that's a bunch of, not true. It's not true. But I just thought it was interesting because that's the mindset a lot of us will go through, if not everyone, where it's like, oh, I suck now because I had one bad day and not even a bad day. He's riding with the best people in the world, right? And he's fine. He's still in it. He didn't get kicked out on the first day. Mm-hmm. But just this like mindset of like shifting it. And probably Tom Pitcock does shift it. And I think he did do well. He rallied. But you can see how that the night before he's going through that same mental process probably all of us go through, after a race that doesn't go well or during a stage race or whatever the situation may be.
For sure. I mean, I even saw that at trials when you actually think about like, okay, you're down to 8 of the best runners in Canada. Like you had to qualify to get to trials.
Mm-hmm. Like I couldn't have just entered this event.
No. And then you have to, get through semifinals and then you're in finals. And this is almost to your point, but not quite the same thing. But like no one cares about second place, which is like really funny to me. Is like these are the top 8 racers. I'm like, if you didn't win, doesn't matter anymore. Like done, whatever. Yeah. And even, the people who won, like, it's sort of ephemeral. So it does really kind of come to like you're racing because you love this and like you can't rest like you can't just be thinking about that last result and like leaning on that because you're out of the sport in a year if you do that.
Right. It has to be about the process and it has to be, why do we go to the event and feel nervous? I really think that that's a big part of it is like you go for that feeling of nervousness or like I have to run for my life because we don't get that in a lot of other things. So we push ourselves into that discomfort, but then ultimately it does come back to like, do you enjoy running and the training process, which is why most of our listeners and why we would do it, right? Is we like going out and running or biking or doing strength or whatever day to day.
Exactly. Okay, let's get into a couple of our Q&As. Okay, question number 1, and this actually is great for what we were just talking about. How to race when not fit or after having some downtime. And I don't know if we're talking about downtime in terms of injury, in terms of family vacation, in terms of like really hectic time at work. That's definitely something I feel like I've been contending with lately, where suddenly work and travel demands have really like made it harder to get in all training. Mm-hmm. So yeah, like I'm on a start line this weekend and I'm a little nervous about it.
Sure. And I mean, it happens. That's the nature of being an adult athlete, if not a professional athlete. We'll see professional athletes be sick or injured and then, have to go to nationals or these other things, right? They're just sort of, you have to jump back in there at some point and you might have a contract. But as a master's athlete, you've maybe signed up for BC Bike Race or Leadville, and then, yeah, you got sick or injured, or your weather was horrible, some of these smoke incidents we've had over the past couple of years. So lots of things that could, derail your training. And so the idea, it would be, it depends a bit where you're coming back into it, but you get back, frequency first is always sort of the idea. You get back a 30-minute spin, a 60-minute spin. And so that might be, in the case of injury or smoke, it might be indoors. It might be, if your knee is giving you trouble, it might be a bit of one leg or cross training. I think when Greg Lehman was on, we maybe talked about the idea of sort of like incorporating, either form fartleks, he calls them, with running, where you sort of mix up your form, so heel strike, toe strike, fast cadence, low cadence. You could certainly do that by mixing up the terrain in that case to get back. In the case of like a knee injury or something like that, where you're easing back into it, it could be one leg mixed in with some core and strength, where you're keeping moving and the heart rate's up, but it's a bit more cross training. So if that was sort of the reason we want to get you back training, first things first, right? Frequency. And then, it depends how much time you would have. If you were the weekend or two beforehand, then you could certainly ease back into getting a longer endurance, right? Because we go volume would be the next step, frequency and then volume. And so I think those sort of tenets are a big part of that. And then I think, you then would get into, you're in it now. And this reminds me of that Rebecca Rush quote when she was on there, sort of our podcast there a while ago, talking about, you're never as prepared as you want to be for these big events.
Right.
So whether it goes right or not, the same athlete emails and thoughts and comments I get, I should have done this. I'm just not feeling fit. And so some of that is a bit of a mindset. And so we want to try and come into it as like, I'm recovered. I'm, really motivated. There's, I don't have maybe you don't have injuries. Maybe we're just disrupted, right? So you have a lot of advantages because you're fresh, you're motivated, you're not injured, hopefully, in the case if you're not injured, you're not injured, you just haven't been training. So you try and carry in those positives. And then I think in the week before, the days before, you're talking about executing as if you're going to do well. So that could be, the pre-riding, the openers, the gear preparation, the planning your aid stations and fueling plan, getting to bed on time, not drinking your sorrows away, this sort of thing, that victim mentality where we start like, doing things that would derail us no matter whether we're coming in right or wrong. And then I think on race day, you get in there and you work as well as you can, you race your race. And I think the only, if we had a strategy during a race and someone was a little undertrained, then I think that's where, again, it depends a bit on the race styling, but you'd maybe go in an endurance race where you'd just be a little more on top of that pacing and fueling because, you might not quite have the form you've had in the past, but you might surprise yourself later. In a cyclocross race or something like that, I don't know. I think you'd just get in there and send it as best you could. But you could certainly do a bit of a, hard start and then try and settle in and save it a little bit if you were a bit nervous about form, as far as pacing it out a bit more. But it's hard to say. Did I miss anything in that ramble?
Well, I think there's a little bit of like a reframe you can do if you genuinely like don't see the race going the way you had initially hoped for. Please go back and listen to last week's episode. I think you can reframe it like, assuming you're a master's athlete, assuming there is no contract or money or sponsorship on the line. So like that includes people like us where racing is very serious. We take it seriously, but like at the end of the day, we are not getting paid to race. Like our livelihood does not depend on you winning nationals, me winning Leadville. Like the stakes are medium. Yeah. So I think like there is a reframe you can do of, especially for something like a BC bike race or something like that, is how much fun can you have on the day? Like if you don't think that performance is really an option any longer, like you're no longer really feeling like you're capable of going for the win, cool. How much fun can you have doing it? Like, I say this to myself all the time in races, like how many people can you smile and wave at? Can you make sure that you thank every volunteer and like come through with like a huge grin on your face? I think little things like that and just kind of shifting your focus to, okay, how can this be enjoyable to me? Can be a huge game changer when it comes to your attitude on race day. Instead of showing up to the line being like, crap, I'm not prepared for this. I'm going to suck. This race is going to suck. Show up and be like, I have no expectations anymore. This can actually just be a literal celebration of, you know, the fact that I'm here, the fact that like I paid for this race. I'm here to do it because I put money, like I'm not getting paid. I literally paid money to be doing this. So why not have fun?
I think that is a great way to look at it. Yeah, you talked about expectations there, where you might have lower expectations because you've had a poor run in, and that's okay. I think sometimes the best events, you know, this is sort of that expectations and reality. It's funny, a lot of times athletes will come away with a really positive experience in these situations because their expectations are lower. And that's not to say we don't aspire to, you know, or have goals, right? But this idea of, you know, just sometimes our expectations get inflated. That's why you talked about the hope there. Hope, you know, I hoped for better. Well, that's not the same as setting a goal, or that's not the same as, you know, actually what you can do, you know, the relevant things. The hopes get tricky, and that's where the expectations, you know, anything can happen. And sometimes it's just, you know, not setting it where it's suddenly you have to win the entire race. Especially if that wasn't ever relevant, we sometimes do these weird tricks to ourselves. So it is funny. A lot of times I'll see athletes, maybe, you know, it's at the end of the season, we'll take like a full rest week on purpose, where they're otherwise healthy. And then they'll go into like this more fun, low key event, you know, that's sort of the week after their A race. So they haven't really trained. They've done like, you know, their provincial or state championships or Leadville or whatever. And then they take almost a whole week with no bike. Bike gets service, they get home from the travel, they sleep a bunch, they go to work, you know, they did things they're supposed to do. And then on the weekend, it's just like a fun local race. And they just somehow, you know, there's a bit of a super compensation maybe off of the race. There's a super, you know, a recovery off of the not doing it. There's a return of like motivation, hormonal status, sleep quality, you know, again, fueling, they're not depleted, which maybe they were through a lot of the season. And then again, their expectations, they sort of have this like, it's just a fun race. I haven't been training. I don't really care. And then they're just like, have the race of their life, and it's like, you know, it'd be easy to think that you should just never train, but that's not the idea, right? It's sort of, you set yourself up with this big race event, lots of recovery, lots of good fueling, and then lower expectations, where you still go in and do the best. You hold yourself to a high standard. You know, you still work as hard as you can, make the best decisions you can, set yourself up to be in a good position, but then your expectations are sort of like, I'm just having fun, and you know, however I shake out, I'll race the race that I end up with. It's funny. It can be a great setup.
Yeah. And this all sort of reminds me of, it was really interesting at track and field trials, talking to Misha after the semi-qualifiers that didn't go well for her on Friday. What she said to me was like, it was weird. My warm-up went great. I was feeling so strong. I was feeling like the best I ever had. And I didn't have a good race. Flip side, literally like 10 minutes later, I was interviewing the girl who won, or the woman who won, I think it was the 100-meter. Apologies if I have the wrong person, but she literally said the exact same thing. Like, I had the best warm up. I was feeling really good. I was feeling really strong. So just sensations pre-race can be incredibly inaccurate.
Sure. And I think that's a great lesson, that when I see athletes who have been racing and training for a long time, they have a lot of experience. So they've experienced a race where they didn't get to train the week before. They've experienced a race where their legs felt slow in the warm-up. And then they've experienced, I actually did really well in those two situations. And then they've experienced what you're saying, the opposite, where it's like, I felt good, I was motivated, and I just got the doors blown off me. Which could be that they still had a great performance, but everyone was having a great performance. You know, surprise at Olympic trials, you know, everyone had a great race, right? Or at at a World Cup, everyone's having a great race.
For sure.
Or Leadville, everyone's, you know, trying to get a 9-minute or a 9-hour belt buckle. So it's that experience that you're building. And then that, I guess, is another reason that we might say, okay, you've had a crummy couple weeks, work travel, injury, illness, whatever, weather. But you're going to get in there, go through the motions, because you're going to get an experience, whether it's, hey, it wasn't that big of a deal. Hey, it was actually a pretty big deal. Or, you know, I learned I could fuel a lot more. I learned if I actually try and do a couple jumps during the race, I actually have fun, and I did really well, and that was fun. And I got into some photos. Like, you want to gather experience, because we know that that's such a great indicator, or a great indicator, a great asset when we're thinking about the overall athlete performance. It's not just like, what is your FTP? How fast do you run per minute, per mile? It's also, how many of these things have you done before? you'll see studies where it's like predicting, especially in longer stuff, right? And there's always that like physiological, like VO2 max or speed at VO2 max or whatever it is, FTP. And those can be fairly predictive. But then when you put in like the race experience, so it's sort of like last year's race results in this race, can actually, like, it just makes it like very predictive.
I love it. Okay, so I think the next question I want to hit here is what to do when you're not hitting power targets outdoors, just because I think that actually does sort of relate a little bit when we're talking about these expectations, realities. Sure. And I can probably include a link in the show notes too. We've definitely done a lot of episodes where we have talked about indoor versus outdoor.
And perfect workouts.
Perfect workouts. And so just to kind of quickly start, if you're using a smart trainer inside and a power meter outside, there's going to be a difference in the power numbers. They are not perfectly calibrated to each other. So definitely expect a difference in power. There's also just so many physiological things that happen when you go from inside to outside. There's a lot more stuff outside that changes the landscape of like what your, quote unquote, perfect power file is going to look like. So let's assume that you're aware of all of those things.
Well, yeah. So you touched on, like, we could work through this. So you're outside, you're trying to do 2 by 20 minutes, sweet spot, we'll say. So moderate efforts, 2 by 20. This could be a runner is going to go 2 by 20, and they're thinking about pace or heart rate. This could be a cyclist thinking about heart rate or power, and they're going to do it outside now. They're going to try this 2 by 20. Their coach, who might be me, has said outside is better. It's variable. It's like the actual environment. You don't want to be a zoo animal captured in this like tiny little cage.
You want to be a three-legged lion swimming across a river with his brother.
3 times they tried.
Did you include that link in the show notes last week?
I think we did include that in the show notes. There was a New York Times article about the brothers setting the record for longest swim, and it's like also a duo swim, so I don't know if they got the FKT for the supported, like, were they supporting each other?
I really just question how many attempts have been made for like,
so these are recorded. Humans record the lion swims. It's a pretty arbitrary category, but they want it.
Anyway, I mean, actually, isn't that masters racing? Like, let's be honest.
Arbitrary. So you were saying, why could you? So I think I should be doing these sweet spot intervals at 200 watts. We'll talk mostly about power just because it's a little more clear. I think 200 watts. That's what I think my coach told me, and I'm not doing 200 watts. So Molly's point of, if your zones are all set off of indoor training, your expectations are based off indoor training, it could be higher or lower outdoors, and that could be because of the power meter. That could be because outside often people do more, but not always. Some people, the challenge of navigating where they're going and the stress of looking where they're going and trying to balance their bicycle, right? Which sounds, that's dumb, but like, no, like for some people, especially, that having to balance the bicycle is a huge physiological and psychological load.
Especially the harder you're going.
So when you think about the load on your body, mental, physical, for some people, the power will often be, for some people, the power will be lower outside. What you would expect would be more the opposite, that like outside we can push more power. But that depends, as you say, also on the power meter. If we've now got separate power meters, we have an indoor smart trainer and then a power meter on our bike, and they're separate. We're not using them in both. A lot of people will use the power meter also indoors to not have this problem or to minimize this problem. You would then have different. So it's just different. So you might have to just go by feeling, go by heart rate, and what can you do for 2 by 20 today? Okay, all right, you did 160 watts, not 200 watts. Well, that's unfortunate that that's lower, but it's just a number. It's a different number. It still felt like 2 by 20 moderate. Heart rate maybe confirms this. It was 85 to 90% of your max heart rate, say. Great, those are good intervals. You know what you do next time? You come back and you do it again, and you try and you could be steadier. Maybe that power is now 165. Lots of different things could change. Maybe just try it in a different area, and now the number is 157, and that's okay too. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, and we can always triangulate that feeling. Did it feel moderate? Did it heart rate? Was it moderate heart rate? In the 80s. Percent wise. So that's what I would probably do there. The other thing I do see is outdoors, you pick a bad spot for it and you're stopping to coast a bunch. And so you're dropping your average, right? You're accumulating a bunch of zeros. The idea with some of these long muscular endurance things is that you would be on the gas for an extended periods. I think these could be certainly done on flat, but then you'll also see that generally people can push more going uphill. And it is a good thing and I always have to challenge myself, as we've joked on the podcast, I always talk about doing intervals on hills, and that's because I mostly do them on hills because I like that. but the skill of the speed of having to try and get on top of the power when the wheels are moving faster, and then, you know, you're pedaling maybe a little faster, is harder. There's nothing to push against, or less to push against than when you're going uphill. And so for a lot of people, suddenly they're going 30 kilometers an hour, 40 kilometers an hour. And so now this like navigation balance is a little trickier. You got to really watch where you're going and push on the pedals fairly hard.
Right.
So that might just be something you have to play with, and it happens quickly. Like that skill is not a tough one in terms of like the skills that we accumulate as cyclists or athletes. If you try that sweet spot 2x20 a few weeks, I bet you, you know, if let's say you could do 200 watts, it's just the coordination and the, you know, the staying steady on the gas is tough. I would say after 3 sessions, you'd be probably getting close to that. You'd figure it out, right? Oh, okay, I get it. You know, maybe a bit in the route, but also just in the like coordination pattern of like having to keep pedaling, and which sometimes feels hard, even though it's still moderate, right? Just because everything's happening fast, at least the way you're perceiving it. So I think there's nothing wrong with that. I don't know if we answered the question completely there. Do you think we got to this idea of like, it's okay if it feels moderate, use your heart rate to triangulate?
Yeah, don't panic.
But don't go back inside just to like try and get 200 watts at 2x20 and quote unquote make it perfect. Right?
I think that's the meat and potatoes of the answer here is like keep trying outside. No. Don't try to go inside
and not to say
make
you can never. I said actually to the one person who asked this that they, you know, if it was like smoky and you can't go outside, or it was pouring rain and your option is no training or doing it indoors, certainly use that tool. But I would, if the choice is there, I would pretty much always go outside. There's always exceptions to when you
for sure.
But that's because that's what you're going to do in your gravel race or your road race or your mountain bike race. You know, we're going to do that, and there's so much benefit, you know, especially when we get into like nature and being outdoors and not looking at a screen, but looking at like the horizon as far as like optical health. And, you know, you could get really kooky with it, but we know that as adults, we want to be happy and like experience outdoors. And I think that's generally a great choice when we can choose it.
Yeah. Now, would you actually ever, if, you know, say someone's been doing this, they've tried this like 4 times and they're still coming up with like a lower thing. Would you lower their power zone, or would you try to troubleshoot the power meter? Would you send them back inside to see if like it's actually even, or what would you do?
Well, I guess that's a key thing. Like, we don't expect the power meters to be the same. Like, I would say we expect them to be different is actually the way we'd go into this. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if it's like really off, right? Like you would expect maybe, I don't know what that percentage would be, but say like 180 versus 200 watts as the setting, you would maybe expect that sort of gap. Like, so what is that? 5%?
I mean,
10%?
That's a huge amount when you actually like, that's, you know, if you're used to 200 and you're seeing 180, that's something that people would absolutely panic about.
Yeah, no, and it would ruin your day if it was lower.
100%.
Completely, I understand that. If it was 5 watts higher, we wouldn't be talking about this for sure.
No, you'd be like, hey, can we bump my...
So I know a lot of the power meters now with the apps actually have like an offset. So I have seen athletes, I don't know that I 100% agree with this idea because I don't know that it completely applies in the way that power is exponential, but you know, whatever. But I've seen people like offset it. So if they go and they ride their smart trainer on the bike with the power meter, they collect both data. Okay, yeah, it's 180 versus 200 watts. They adjust it by 20 watts. And I think that's fine. As long as it's consistent day to day, it wouldn't ever really change, you know, because then you would have your TSS settings and your threshold settings and all this stuff. It would be appropriate to you. You know, you probably want to be careful because if you start getting a bunch of peaks doing that, and then, you know, you go back to using a power meter that isn't offset, then you might end up, you know, very sad and not being able to get close to that in the future. But I think if it keeps you training, that's probably a fine solution. But if it started getting like it's reading 400 watts instead of 200 watts, that's an obvious, like you should send your power meter back for, and that's the nature of power meters, right? They're going to break.
Right.
I always say it's like an iPhone strapped to the bottom of your bicycle and you ram your pedals and all this. Like, imagine that was your iPhone just strapped to your bottom bracket.
For sure.
Like, how long would you think that thing would work? Right. So it's amazing. When they last more than a year, I'm always amazed. Mm-hmm. It's stupid. It's like the most expensive, stupid thing. And they are getting so much better than they used to be as far as like tolerance to rain and so forth. But yeah, it's
still just wild. Yeah.
It is. So the other important thing we didn't really touch on there is like, I'm saying 200 watts, but the actual range or zone is very big. Even 180 versus 200 watts. Go and type that into a zone calculator in Training Peaks. You could just recalculate your zones. You don't have to apply them if it's not relevant, but just look at the difference because it's like nothing. The zones are the same. So if you're actually just using the zone and expecting that day to day there'll be variation, if I'm on flat versus this, hot versus cold, stressed from work and it's the end of the day versus Saturday, you know, it's the first thing you do, there is going to be probably more than 20 watts of acceptable range. So just use the range is often what I will like respond back when it's like someone says, oh, it was 5 watts lower this week. Well, there you go. I guess that's true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's great. That's normal. That's what we expect, especially when it's variability too, right? If this is, I think on the trainer, we expect things to be, there's like less variability, but outside there's always going to be variability. And that's great. That's the nature of racing and our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, last question, and let's just touch on this lightly because we are going to do a whole post on it, possibly even like a little video for Instagram, maybe. Okay. We'll see. Okay. Just how to start using your dropper post more. And this is funny because this is a question that a listener came up with, but I actually had a similar question the other week because I was on my mountain bike for the 3rd time this year, really turning into a professional mountain biker here.
You're newer to dropper posts. You've had them on your bikes, but you're still, I would say, newer to
had them on my bike. I've never had it on one.
So this is your first bike with a dropper post, which is lots of people, especially on the East Coast side of things and the more racy side of things.
And longtime listeners will know I have an issue with shifting at the best of times, which means
Molly doesn't.
I don't.
That's the problem.
That's the issue.
Or the situation. Maybe it's not even a problem. You do great.
I don't think it's a problem. I think I'm fine. Well, I think a 30 to 45 RPM is the sweet spot. At any rate, all this to say, I don't shift a lot, which means I'm not really super good at using my shifters at the best of times. So the dropper is, the little clicky button where you would shift.
Sure.
I don't typically use shifters to begin with, so therefore, it's still a motion that is not super common for me to do. I don't shift. Therefore, I do not drop my post. I also just struggle with, my trail knowledge is not fantastic. So if I'm in a place I haven't ridden before, I don't really know when the time is appropriate to drop it. I also have slight nerves that once dropped, it is going to stay dropped and not come up because I'm not going to lie. It actually is kind of unreliable. I have used it before and then had to stop and push it back up because it doesn't pop.
Yeah, it probably doesn't get used very much.
Yeah, it doesn't get used very much.
Rusty.
A little rusty. At any rate, I don't really use it very often. And to be fair, I've noticed a lot of the people I ride with don't use the droppers.
Which is a East Coast, Ontario thing. I think probably if you're from big mountains, it's more obvious where, and it's less often during the ride, but it's sort of you climb up the mountain and then you go down for, 10 or 20 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it is. It's obviously you're going downhill and there's switchbacks and things that would make you motivated to drop your posts so you don't flip over your handlebars.
Whereas we have little tiny moments.
So you might only drop it for a second or 5 seconds or something like that, right? Our longest descent might be, that I can think of having a post dropped maybe is 3 minutes or something in Ontario. It's really not a long time. So yeah, how do you start using it? And so you're isolating a bunch of things where when you're a newer rider, especially, there's a lot of stuff going on the handlebars. Maybe we're still dealing with braking and shifting well. A lot of these things that we would think is sort of fundamental. And so the dropper post is sort of similar to braking where, you could start. I wouldn't spend a lot of time in a field or an open space, but a less complicated space where maybe you just, for no reason, you just practice putting it down, putting it back up. So down and back across the field, and you try and get it up and down 10 times. You sit on it, get the button figured out. How much weight do you put on it? Pop it back up, and then do it again for no reason, right? And I don't want to do a lot of that no reason, what they call decontextualized use. But then what we could do is we could set up whatever obstacle you're comfortable with, a little whoop or a little jump or a little log or a little downhill even. It doesn't have to be treacherous, but we sort of say, okay, now you're going to, before this, practice putting it down for a reason that would be relevant on the trail. It's a little steep drop off. It's a little log hop. We're going to put it down, get into a ready position, do the thing. Important there, I think, is that the thing you're doing is something that you already can do with your post high, but you're going to drop it and see, oh, okay, how is this? You're probably going to find that because we've now dropped your points of contact down to 4, you have your hands and your feet, you don't have your post. And even though you're standing in a ready position, a lot of times you might still base off the seat. And that's what a lot of people who have been riding for a long time tell me is they feel like they're lost on their bike. They don't have that seat sort of touching their legs or where they can sit down just for an instant to recenter or find their balance again. So that would be the next thing I would do. Okay, we played with it in the field. You sort of get it. Then I would actually say, let's go for like a ride on a low technical trail. And we're going to drop and this might just be one short uphill if you're comfortable uphill, and maybe a tiny loop or something. We're going to do a couple laps without putting it, in almost an artificial way where you have to actually start pedaling without your post. And then you can coast. You can coast as much as you want. We're not breaking speed records. Your seats, as you say, it's stuck down. This is our game we're playing. It's stuck down. We have to ride home or like get from here to there, and we can't put our seat up. And you can't sit down. You're not allowed to sit down on the drop post. So you have to this might be a standing lesson now, standing pedaling, standing coasting, finding your balance spot where that seat's removed. And I would do that for up to 20 minutes. We've done it when people start, which gets sort of funny. But once you figure it out, you know how to find your balance. You know how to find ready position. You know how to find, what we call neutral, or like a recovery standing with straight legs. And you can pedal comfortably, and then you descend and you have some fun. And it's sort of goofy. We wouldn't do this every day. This isn't something to belabor. But that's sort of what I would do to just sort of get used to your balance position. So those are sort of three things. We're in the field, something you're comfortable with. We're doing the dropper down challenge where the dropper's stuck down and you have to ride a certain amount of time. And then the next one I would do is find something on trail. Again, a little more technical. This could just be like a descent with a couple corners, or like, again, something you've ridden it before. It's not the end of the world. And we would do some laps of that again, where you're getting used to like dropping into it. And then maybe we start adding some speed or some variety in there as far as, maybe we're riding together or for, a faster time, something like that. And then from there, you've sort of gotten used to it. So you can now start integrating. You've pressed that button a lot of times. You've dropped it back, got it back up. Then we can start doing the more unexpected trail riding where, you have to do it, right? In the same way that you sometimes have to bunny hop or corner or brake when you don't know what's coming, right? And so this is that unexpected sort of like blind riding that we have to then get used to. Mm-hmm. So I would say those are sort of like the three things I've been using there, which I don't think are rocket science. Maybe that dropper down challenge is sort of an idea you could play with.
Yeah, I think my only additional thought would actually just be like put a little piece of painter's tape or masking tape either on your handlebars or on your top tube that just says use your dropper. Which sounds stupid, but like it's the same thing. I've said it before about like eating food or drinking on the bike. Mm-hmm. I think just having that visual, visible reminder actually does serve as the bit of a like little cue just to remind you that it's there. Mm-hmm. Might even want to like throw some like hot pink tape or something around the actual like shifter for the dropper that'll drop it down. Mm-hmm. Just like make it more visible, because I think a lot of the time the issue isn't that someone doesn't want to use it. It's just that they're not thinking of it.
Well, we talk a lot about process goals, and sometimes I feel like we stumble, right? It's sort of hard to come up with process and practice goals. But I mean, honestly, that's it. Try those three things I just spoke about, but it could also be a number of drops during the ride, or, just, using it once during the ride. And that's the goal, right? It's really that simple, is you have to use it. And then once you use it and get comfortable, as someone who's grown up not having one, I can ride most things without it. It doesn't really bug me that much because I've done it my whole life on super sketchy bikes. But it's definitely way better. Like if you were like, let's see how high of a log or this really technical high speed, that I certainly use it now. They are great. So, I mean, it is better. So it is sort of just, you may have to learn a few new tricks like standing up, which we do think is a super important thing especially for off-road riders, but certainly for road riders too, right? If you can stand and climb, when I have road riders come to me and they're like, oh, I hate climbs. It's like, well, you don't ever stand up. The fastest people who go uphill and really love climbing generally stand up.
Remember there was that weird moment in time where everyone was like, you shouldn't stand up to climb?
Well, and I should say you still seat. Like seated is still very efficient.
Up for like 30 minutes.
I actually always say this is like a Bicycling Magazine article where it's like seated climbing is very efficient, which is true. No, but sometimes we need to be inefficient and go fast.
That's literally the bicycling article I'm talking about. It was like a big thing back in like the early aughts where I think, was it Indurain? One of the like super top guys never stood up, and then everyone was like, oh, we shouldn't stand up to climb. You're like
Jan Ulrich. So that, I mean, he was, there's that whole thing.
There's some stuff.
But yeah, generally you'll see bigger people, taller people, whatever, more muscular people, they can sit longer because they have lots of muscle to hit the pedal. And it also costs a bit more to be squatting up and down, right? You have to lift your upper body up and down. So you will see that trend. But that's not to say that like Jan Ulrich never stood up, right? Like never, right? And that's also not to say, someone like Contador, again, great examples. Smaller people tend to stand lots because they have to use all the body mass they have to try and turn the pedals over while they're going very quickly. So you will see that mix, but you certainly at some point, especially off-road, you can't be sitting on the saddle, or else it's sort of like this clunk, 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 where the bike, you're almost doing a backflip and you're getting stuck in every divot. So you sometimes have to stand up, and then also there's this, that you have to keep the gear moving over, and in mountain biking or gravel, you're going to get stuck sometimes. Certainly, like you'll run out of gears in gravel, right? So you do have to stand sometimes. So that's super, super important. That's sort of like a tangent, but
that was very tangential.
It is related to like why we might use droppers. And I'm loving it now because it is actually this constraint where we can say, put your dropper down, and not to do anything technical. We're actually now, okay, this is a 1 minute hill, drop her down. It's not there anymore. And we're going to do a hill interval, 5 by 1 minute hill intervals with drop her down to try and motivate like exploring standing. And now you wouldn't probably stand the entire 1 minute climb in a race. You'd get very fatigued, right? You'd be in and out of the saddle depending on your cadence and what's happening on for traction. But what a great intervention, right? And we didn't used to be able to do that. You'd have to say stand up, but then there was really nothing to force that you had to stand up. I guess you could have like removed their seat post or something, back when we had the quick release.
I miss those days so much.
Anyhow, so dropper posts are great. Use them. And hopefully those are some ideas.
Yeah. If you have any other questions for us, head over to consummateathlete.com. We have a fancy new contact form. You can also find us on Instagram at Consummate Athlete. And definitely head to there to see some of the videos we talked about from this episode, and also to, see all the stuff that's on the blog. All right. With that, we'll leave you to it. Happy training, and we will see you next. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.